Hello, my name is Bryant. I'm your TA for this course, and today I'm going to discuss some of the history of Protestant hymns, a popular American religious musical movement, and a bit of my thesis research on how this movement influenced the 19th century Lutheran Church. Hymns are an important aspect of Christian worship. They are used to teach doctrine, cement group identity, and make the act of worship more beautiful. Like all forms of art, hymns have played an important role in Christian history, shaping liturgies and framing political and theological movements. One of the best examples of this is the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther believed strongly that hymns should be sung by every member of the congregation, rather than solely by the choir. Furthermore, he believed these hymns were an excellent way to teach the theology he was trying to popularize, and he wanted his songs to be simple and easy for people to memorize, since printing hymnals were still a rare thing. All three of these goals found their home in the chorale tradition. These were simple one-part melodies that could easily be made to highlight dogmatic statements by holding notes of different lengths at different points. A classic example of this is A Mighty Fortress is Our God. It's easy, memorable, and loaded with a systematic theology that's useful for teaching Lutheranism. To help spread these hymns around, Luther's followers took to an old German tradition, Singschulen, or song schools. These were headed by a Meistersinger, or master singer, who taught lay people how to sing well, as well as the basics of music. One of the traditions that came out of these song schools was interchanging songs and poetry, creating something known as contrafactum, which took popular secular songs, like drinking songs, and replaced the words in them with religious poetry. Many Protestant hymns have their roots in popular folk melodies. They were also used to attack political and religious opponents during the Reformation as a sort of hymn-based propaganda. These song schools, the chorales and the contrafacta, were not limited to Luther's followers. Reformers from Switzerland and Germany also participated, though Reformed churches have historically preferred psalm singing in worship. German migration to the American colonies began in earnest in the 18th century. Many of these migrants moved to Pennsylvania, which had a policy of religious toleration. The descendants of German Anabaptists preferred to live further out in rural areas, while Lutheran and Reformed immigrants tended to be more urban. These urban communities were more likely to have union churches, intermarry with each other, and engage in broader English society. However, they resisted the pressure to anglicize. As a result, German churches were slow to shift language. One prominent German Lutheran leader remarked that the Episcopal worship was close enough in doctrine that any Lutheran who wanted English worship could simply go there instead. Other leaders, such as Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, were more sympathetic to transition. He was known to occasionally perform English services for non-Germans. However, for many of the leaders of the Pennsylvania Church, Lutheran identity was as much or more to do about ethnic heritage than doctrinal position. In the late 18th century, Muhlenberg's General Synod began publishing hymnals for their congregations. These were text-only blocks of poetry with a chorale tune listed as the melody. The poetry in these books was very reliably metered, so that congregations only needed to know a few basic melodies to be able to sing them. To help with this, German song school tradition again flourished among the Pennsylvania Dutch. This slide is taken from the 1803 General Synod hymnal and presents a piece of a hymn number 170, showing the standard layout. The melody is given, Kommt her zu mir, a tune associated with a different set of words. The block of text below the melody is the poetry for this particular hymn. Let's explore the contents of this hymnal briefly, because it gives us a glimpse into what the Synod thought was important. There are 718 hymns in this book. They are organized topically, with death and resurrection taking up nearly 10% of the text. Justification is a close second at 8% of the text in the book. There are also songs in the book to sing at grace, before meals, and for various rituals outside of church. The English colonists were also experiencing a tremendous amount of religious change during this period. In England, the Protestant Reformation helped drive a number of institutions to assist in teaching lay people how to read and write, as well as singing music. English Reformed theology strongly supported unison psalm singing by the laity, and Puritan communities were often loud and boisterous song singers in worship. The Puritan colonists continued this tradition and published many collections of metrical psalms, or psalms from the Bible set to different meters or poetic syllable schemes. Long meter, for instance, is 4 lines of 8 syllables each. English psalmody was rigorously metered, and this allowed people to remember a few simple tunes of each meter and sing the whole book of Psalms. Due to a lack of musical instrumentation and printing capacity, the earliest colonists typically lined out their songs, with one person singing the first line of a melody, which the congregation would then repeat. As printing capacity increased in the colonies, text-only hymnals became popular, creating a canon of familiar composers and styles. Even when urban areas developed enough to produce music instrumentation, English churches often preferred to stick to a cappella music. As the colonists took new land and the population of their urban centers grew, church power over all aspects of daily life weakened. As a result, churches had to compensate to meet new demands of their environment. By the early 18th century, education became a more secular activity, and churches were no longer able to guarantee that their children knew how to sing, and as a result, the singing school tradition emerged. Similar to the German song schools, these were extracurricular groups, usually teenagers and new converts, led by a singing master who taught the basics of music theory and a few easy songs to memorize. By the middle of the 18th century, this movement was beginning to flourish. Singing school masters were able to travel the countryside and earn a modest living, and as printing capacity expanded in the colonies, they often began publishing their own tune books to sell at their schools. Many of these schoolmasters became popular composers, some mixing sacred poetry with secular European music, while others would write their own songs. One example of a schoolmaster who adapted secular European music can be found in the song Friendship. This was published in the 1798 American Music Miscellany. The song takes an air written by Handel in 1736 and sets it to words written by a man named Bidwell in 1789. The most influential composer of the other type, who composed his own melodies with complex harmonies, is William Billings. Active in the latter half of the 18th century, Billings helped popularize a radically different form of hymnody from what Puritans sang. Instead of one-part melodies sung in unison, Billings preferred 3 or 4-part complex harmonies and a rapid style of round singing called fuguing. Around 1800, a number of important events happened that forced the German Lutheran Church to change. First, immigration all but ceased from Germany, largely due to the Napoleonic conflicts and the newly formed United States restricting contact with the Old World. Prior to this, pastors in the New World were trained in Germany and had come as missionaries targeting the German population. The church faced a significant obstacle in the lack of state funding, with little to no church infrastructure. Old understandings of the relationship between the church and the state and the people had to change. Second, pressure from English society to universalize and conform to a new standard American culture began to mount. Pennsylvania began the construction of public boarding schools to teach German youth how to speak English, and English was increasingly necessary to participate in daily life. Those who wanted jobs in urban areas needed a firm command of the language in order to succeed, and as many Lutheran churches were in or near urban centers, their youth were at risk for leaving for other congregations and taking their money with them. Third, popular religious movements began to sweep through the Northeast that the church would have to grapple with. Charles Grandison Finney led a series of revivals throughout the Northeast and published his model for others to copy. Lutherans tried his method with mixed results, but the German Reformed congregations took to them rapidly. Because of the strong connection between the Lutherans and the Reformed and the high rate of intermarriage, cultural changes in one group were bound to affect another. It should be noted that the principal theology of the early Methodist movement in these awakenings involved a conscious choice to accept Jesus, and many Lutherans argued over whether this was an effective metaphor for salvation by faith or a form of works righteousness. Additionally, independent voluntary religious organizations had to compete for members, and the concept of the Christian denomination began to form. As mentioned earlier, many German Lutheran leaders believed that Lutheranism was less to do with doctrine and more to do with family and heritage, an idea rooted in the German land church model. It did not bother them to see those congregants who wanted English services leave for other Protestant churches. During this time, however, a new concept developed in America, denominationalism, and churches began to focus more on their doctrine and theology rather than their ethnic makeup. The drop in immigration caused the Lutheran numbers to decline, and they increasingly saw themselves as a distinct theological entity whose doctrines needed preserving. This membership crisis would force them to change course. While this pressure was mounting on the Lutherans, a book was published that is the central event of this lecture. William Little and William Smith published in 1803 a new musical notation system designed to make teaching music easier, the Easy Instructor. This book became immediately popular with singing schools, and the system was widespread within the revival movement of the early 19th century. Little and Smith's new system bears some exploration before we move on, in order to understand why it was so revolutionary. Historically, music notation was not standardized. though it began to be so through the Middle Ages. The lack of widespread, well-tuned instruments also meant that vocal singing had to be trained differently. Singing schools came about to help with these. Notice on this woodcut that the singers are sharing a piece of music and the instructor is pointing to a specific note. Each note on the scale corresponds to a spoken syllable to help singers differentiate. This is called a solfege system, and it has its roots in medieval Italy. When printing capacity began to expand, different systems and styles of notation were created, but there was still little standardization, and singing school masters would try to innovate to make their systems more memorable and generate more sales. Little and Smith took the solfege system and gave each syllable a shape. Fa is a triangle, sol is a circle, la is a square, and mi is a diamond. This way, the standard scale reads fa, so, la, mi, fa, and you can reliably approximate note placement by sight. It looks funny to modern eyes because music education is much more standardized and widespread today, but when you learn the system, its primary goal is quite successful, and you can easily sight read music with accuracy. Let's take a few minutes to explore what shape note singing is. Songs are split into 4 parts: bass, tenor, treble, and alto. Unlike the music you're probably used to seeing in church, the melody sits with the tenors and is composed of all voices. The lowest harmonies are in the bass, while the highest harmonies are with the treble, again, mixed voices. The altos are a sort of middle harmony, usually just from higher voiced octaves. Singers gather in a square with a hollow middle, and someone chooses a song to lead. Then someone will, either the leader or a designated person, sets the pitch or the key that the song will be sung at, and the whole group, called a class, sings through the song by sounding out the associate syllables with each note. This will probably sound like gibberish, but it makes it possible to sing songs cohesively as a group, even if it's brand new. Afterwards, the song starts over with the words. This example is the song Old Hundred. Originally a metrical setting of the 100th Psalm, it has taken on new life in liturgical churches as a doxology, and you may well have sung it before as Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Aside from the note head innovation, the Easy Instructor also had a section in it for teaching the rudiments of music, which helped not only new student learners, but also would-be singing school instructors. Because of this, itinerant singing school instructors started spreading through old urban centers and into new rural areas, disseminating the Little and Smith method rapidly. In 1810, a man named Joseph Dahl published what was more or less a direct translation of the Easy Instructor into German. There is strong evidence that it was a popular book in German circles. The German Lutheran leaders of Philadelphia strongly pushed back against any effort to anglicize their ministry and preferred to stick to their chorales, but this book was still successful due to its benefit to singing schools. By 1821, Joseph Dahl had published 4 editions, all in German, and had added some new songs. It was in this year, though, that another man, Johannes Rothbaus, published his own shape note tune book, Die Franklin Harmonie. This book was the first bilingual shape note tune book, and it exhibits a lot of innovations. The most significant, the first 60 songs, are all chorale tunes, set with 3 or 4 part harmonies. The rest are mostly popular English melodies set with German and English songs, usually an unrelated German poem with a meter that works for the English song. This book continued to be published while Dahl's stopped being published in 1821, suggesting that it won that publishing battle. The work of both books in disseminating and popularizing not only new styles of music, but the same tunes that were spreading like wildfire throughout New England meant that when Charles Finney arrived to preach revival in Philadelphia in 1828, the songs he brought with him were already familiar to congregations. There were several German Lutheran and Reformed congregations taken with his preaching, and some Lutheran churches began practicing revival along his methods. There's one particular song I want to point out from the Franklin Harmonie, Lennox. The words of this tune were written by Charles Wesley in 1750, and the tune is by Louis Edson in 1782. It's one of only a handful of songs in the Franklin Harmonie that are directly translated from English into German. This meant that any Germans singing the song were exposed to a pure Wesleyan doctrine. Furthermore, the song is tremendously fun to sing. Let's listen to a modern singing of it, which features a fugue. In 1893, a child denomination of the General Synod assembled their own hymnal called the Church Book with Music. Along with some other notable features, it contains the tune of Lennox, with modifications from how it appeared in the Franklin. Notably, the words were replaced with a more Lutheran source. While it is likely that this tune arrived to Lutheran singers from multiple sources, Lennox had a prominent place in singing schools and the shape note singing tradition, and it is likely that the Franklin Harmonie is one of the routes by which it arrived to the German Lutherans. Shape note singing began to take on a life of its own in 1816 when Ananias Davison published the Kentucky Harmonie. This book drew on popular singing school tunes from the North and folk hymn traditions of rural America. The Kentucky Harmonie went under a few revisions, the last in 1826, and was eventually swept under the tide of publications that continued. The next major tune book came in 1835, the Southern Harmonie, compiled by William Walker. This tune book was a tremendous financial success and brought the New England singing school tradition to the southern United States. If you look in nearly any denominational hymnal in the U.S., chances are very high you will find a song by either Ananias Davison or found in Walker's Southern Harmonie. By the middle of the 19th century, the German Lutherans in Pennsylvania were, as a group, moving in strides towards English, but the Anabaptists did so more sporadically. Some still don't use English in liturgy or daily life today. In 1832, a man named Joseph Funk brought shape note music to the Mennonites with the creation of a compilation of genuine church music, later called the Harmonia Sacra, which is still in publication today. In 1844, the other most important tune book was published in Georgia, the Sacred Harp, which has been in continuous publication and singing since its first edition, remaining relatively true to the original four-shape style and canon, resisting some influences of gospel music. The shape note tradition has continued, largely dying out in the North until the late 20th century, but surviving in gospel circles and rural Southern churches. The Sacred Harp has remained in continuous publication and singing since its first print. The previous song examples were both taken from the most recent publication of the Sacred Harp. The books we sing from feature not only preserved old songs, but also new compositions, making this both a living tradition and a unique preservation of a historical art and practice. By the middle of the 19th century, a period of change had come upon the American Lutheran Church. By 1850, the Lutherans had largely transitioned to English, set up their own seminary in Gettysburg, and even had a few schisms. Generally, they settled into an American identity and began working towards a unified and cohesive understanding of what it meant to be a Lutheran in America. As the 19th century progressed, shape note books continued to be common in German Lutheran circles. Two notable examples are the Pennsylvanische Choralharmonie and the Cantica Sacra. The Pennsylvanische Choralharmonie was a bilingual tune book, and from the start contained both English tunes and chorale tunes. It was financially successful and remained in print until the 1890s. The Cantica Sacra, first published in 1854, stands out because it was compiled by a Lutheran pastor with the intent of being used in Lutheran worship, again suggesting there was a link between shape note and singing school traditions and Lutheran worship. Evangelical hymnody left its mark on the American Lutheran Church. The 1893 edition of the Hymnal Church Book with Music had a different structure and purpose from the 1803 Liedersammlung. 26% of this book was concerned with the church year and liturgy, with sanctification taking up another 17%. Almost half the songs in this book were written by prominent evangelical authors. This book seems to lean strongly into an American identity rather than relying on the old world understanding of what it meant to be Lutheran. In 1917, when the Norwegian Lutherans in the Midwest merged and considered their first English language hymnal, they expressed a lot of concern about the potential for losing their doctrinal purity by becoming too American. The Pennsylvania Germans were their example of acculturation run amok. Of course, now those congregations are all part of the ELCA. Hymnody continues to play an important part of Lutheran worship and identity, and has frequently been a point of cooperation and contention between denominational bodies. While the Sacred Harp largely declined from the national eye after 1900, largely thanks to improved public music education, it never died. It has survived in the South until the 1970s, when renewed interest in folk music started to bring it to the attention of singers elsewhere in the country. Since the 1990s, it has grown even more, and there are now regular singings in all 50 states and numerous new singings in Europe and elsewhere around the world. Minnesota boasts a large and active community. We gather twice a week with 3 major weekend events throughout the year in the absence of a major pandemic. Thank you for joining me as I share not only my research, but also the spiritual and musical community that I'm involved in. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions.